Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, powered by FanDuel Sportsbook. And then there were 16 teams remaining vying for the top prize in all of college basketball as we inch ever so close to the tip-off of the Sweet 16. I am your host, Todd Furman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. But before we kick things off and break down all 8 games on the Thursday and Friday slate, I want to encourage all of you to go to FanDuel.com, use the promo code BetTheBoard, take advantage of all the great offers that FanDuel has in store for you just in time for the tournament. Risk-free wagers, parlay insurance, single-game parlay opportunities, you name it, FanDuel has you covered from now until they crown the national championship in New Orleans 2 weeks from Monday. And Payne, before we get into some of the big games, wanted to get your overall sense and takeaway of what you saw transpire over the 96 hours this past weekend.
Nobody's good.
We knew that coming in. I don't think you had to wait and see 48 basketball games to come away with that observation.
Tough. And this will sound weird, but the only thing in stone that I said was tweeted out before the tournament, and it seemed to all kind of come to fruition in that Memphis was substantially better than a 9 seed. Houston was substantially better than a 5 seed. Houston was better than Duke. The Mountain West was an absolute fraud.
Now, to your credit, you've been the torchbearer for the Mountain West. You've been the torchbearer for the Mountain West, saying it's a fraud every year, and this has gone on for 8 to 10 years. The problem being, I'm not smart enough to blindly just bet against the Mountain West, and I'd probably be hitting 97%.
If you really remove Musselman's Nevada teams, which had multiple pros, they're dreadful in March. And it's something that is somewhat close to me without divulging too much, that I used to attend the Mountain West Conference tournament every single year in Vegas. And it's just a different style of basketball. Nobody defends. Nobody plays pressure defense other than San Diego State, and it's why they have traditionally been very good in that conference. And so when they go up in class and face bigger, stronger, more athletic guys, and they are in their face, it looks different. And the biggest joke to me and why, this space is, I think, heading in a scary direction is anytime a player doesn't perform at peak, we have the casual fans on social media yelling, this is a fix, someone was throwing a game, blah, 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 blah. And we started to see that with Maldonado against Indiana. Suddenly he can't post up everybody because he's not stronger than those guys, and he faced a good defense in Indiana, and he had 9 turnovers in the game, and you see people yelling, fix. It's no, just he stepped up in class and faced someone that actually defends and plays pressure defense and is stronger and more physical, and he ends up turning the ball over left and right. So that conference was phony to me. Obviously, you have shocks and surprises. No one saw St. Peter's here. And we'll go into that game in a little bit more detail, but though there's some of the surprising things, I liked what I saw from Gonzaga in the second half against Memphis. That potentially can propel them moving forward, kind of fighting and winning against that demon. They beat the internal dragon, and Drew Timmy's comments after the game were quite telling. So those were some of the things that we saw, right? What was the other thing I tweeted out? That Michigan is extremely deserving, and they were very fortunate based on where they were located in some of those games and who they played in some of those matchups. You got to give them credit, right? They were better than an 11 seed by our power ratings, and here we are. So a lot of the things that I kind of forecasted before the tournament came to fruition. But one thing I will say, and I think probably makes some sense to talk about even in this setting, we probably should have mentioned it on the last podcast, but we know a lot of new people are coming into this space. College basketball is the swingiest sport you're going to bet ever, especially with kids at this age. The variance, yes, St. Peter's is here, and again, it'll be a game we talk about, but you actually look at the advanced box score, and it's a 22-point Kentucky win. And that's what can happen in a variant sport like this in a 40-minute setting. I mean, even the game we gave out, Todd, and it lost. And that's one thing we always kind of talk about. We'll mention our losses, but it loses because a guy named Chad Baker-Mazzara, who only plays 12 minutes a game and averages 6 points, comes in off the bench in the first half and scores 15 points in 6 minutes in the first half, understead at that point. And that's what you're going to get in these one-game samples, that really anything can happen. And I guess from our podcast perspective, it's we lose a best bet in week 3, no biggie. We got 3 more podcasts a week for the next 20 weeks. Here, we're doing 3 podcasts, 1 a show. And so the variance sport becomes super swingy, from a podcast perspective as well.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's a great point, especially for those new bettors here, whether it's the tournament or any of their other betting pursuits, is that the larger the sample size you have, you fall victim to variance less and less. So if you're taking 100 trials, of course, you could have some of those extended stretches of futility or success. And it's why the running joke is that even the worst handicappers in the world are going to find stretches during their betting careers where they're going to go 10-0. And even the best handicappers in the world are going to have 20-game stretches where they may go 5-15, but you take that out over a much larger sample size, and it just becomes a blip on the radar. To your point, talking about St. Peter's, we did have a chance to talk to John Sheeran before the show, and of course, we'll have that interview for you guys after we get through the Thursday games. I think he brought up some great points and some fascinating numbers he's going to share that I know our listeners will truly enjoy hearing. But we do have plenty of ground to cover, 8 big games on the docket, Payne, so let's go in rotation order, and we'll kick things off, with the night game Thursday coming from San Antonio, Houston, Arizona. People going, wait, this game doesn't go until 7 o'clock Pacific. We're going in rotation order to keep things simple, so that's how we're going to set it up here. It's the Arizona Wildcats.
If John's listening right now, you're hating.
Oh, there's no doubt.
Similar to our golf conversation earlier during recording. You're
John may hate
John,
this,
but
along with some of our casual listeners who go, what the hell? These guys can't do it in chronological order, but it's the school that we've been brought up in, and it's the school we're going to continue to espouse until someone makes these betting index numbers go obsolete. It's Arizona, a 1.5 point favorite on the heels of outlasting TCU in the round of 32. Total in this game sits at 145.5. And when you look at the aforementioned Houston Cougars, who were underseeded coming into the tournament, their win over Illinois was the first for the program over a single-digit seed since 1984. Keeping in mind that last year, Houston, who won 4 games to get to the Final Four before they ran into the buzzsaw of Baylor, beat double-digit seeds en route to doing so. Kelvin Sampson takes his team back to the 3rd straight Sweet 16, holding Illinois to 34% from the floor and forcing 17 turnovers in the victory. Meanwhile, Arizona, while they stepped up in class on some level, had to deal with some athletes and the offensive rebounding of TCU, but that's the nice luxury you have for Tommy Lloyd when you have 2 shot makers who account for all 10 points your team scored in overtime and were even more dominant than that between Benedict Mathurin and Koloko combining for 58 points, which was more than a lot of teams scored in total. But Payne, a fascinating number for a variety of reasons, and a game that I've had a lot of casual fans text me about. How the hell is Arizona, as a number 1 seed, only a modest 1.5 point chalk against Houston?
Everyone now understands how real Houston is and how great of a coach Calvin Sampson is. And take nothing away from the man you mentioned and Tommy Lloyd. He's done a great job managing Sean Miller's players. But with extra time, I'm sure Calvin Sampson will cook something up here. And the one thing that was very impressive to me on a quick flip game, how Calvin Sampson elected to change some things up and defend Kofi in the post and basically rendered him non-existent and frustrated him. And Calvin Sampson's really good, like really, really good. And this game is being played in San Antonio as well, less than a 3-hour drive from Houston. So fully expect a home court advantage for Houston there. All of those things are why we have seen the number where it's at and why Houston +3 -20 and +2 were taken by professional bettors, and we're now at this consensus 1.5 as we record Wednesday rather. So that's kind of the reason for the questions you've been asked on price. Nobody likes Houston, I think, more than me, and I've been hesitant to join the party on Houston. And I think there's this interesting element within this game where it's kind of like the chicken or egg debate. Because offensively for Houston, they want to crash the offensive glass, and you mentioned that with how well TCU did. Houston was number 2 coming into this tournament in crashing the glass. And the opponent Arizona just played in TCU is now number 1 in offensive rebounding after they got 20 offensive rebounds against Arizona. But there's going to be this decision made that impacts the advantage for Houston. And if you know rebounding the defensive glass is the priority and probably the number 1 point of emphasis for Tommy Lloyd in Arizona, the question I have is, can Arizona rebound the ball without going to like this Twin Towers lineup? If Arizona can create this stalemate on that end, rebounding their own glass, and they don't have to go to the big lineup, and Houston continues to crash the glass, it then could lead to cheap points because we know Arizona likes to get out. 29% of Arizona shots come in transition. It's the 18th highest rate in the country, and Arizona is ridiculous converting in transition. 64% of effective field goal percentage, second best in the country in transition. But if Arizona can't rebound their glass, or if Houston is hitting shots and doesn't need to crash the glass as much, it doesn't allow Arizona to get cheap points in transition. So it's very much swingy as to that element of the game, but it's going to be massive. There's also some matchups defensively for Houston that bode well. There are very few teams on paper in the country that match up as well against Arizona because Arizona wants to get inside. Houston, 11th in near proximity shots allowed, so they don't actually let you get in there. Arizona does a very good job themselves scoring on second chance opportunities. Houston, 16th, allowing teams to convert second chances. So that's kind of the interesting element there for this game. The one fear I do have, and why I didn't move on Houston, in this pick-em-like game, Houston's not overly reliable from the free throw line, 327th in the country from the foul line. And we also know how vital Jamal Sheed was off the bounce against Illinois, kind of creating and setting some stuff up for others. But I do wonder if Houston has enough shot creators against a very long Arizona team. And so those were my concerns where you're getting no favors on price at this point. There's no favors being done. But ultimately, we were talking about this off air, the next move is probably the one that matters most. If this goes back to Arizona -2, which is a very key number in basketball, it's probably telling. If this slides back down to pick, that's going to be quite telling. So I think the next move likely determines probably the winner of this game.
I mean, we said it before. I mean, Houston deserves a ton of credit. Kelvin Sampson had to replace 4 starters off last year's team that got to the Final Four, lost 2 key contributors, most notably Marcus Sasser earlier this season. Probably a game you'd love to have Sasser's playmaking ability out there against a team that's offensively as dynamic as Arizona. Credit to the Cougars, who've gone not only 5-0 straight up, but have covered all 5 of those games, winning each contest by 10-plus points per game. When you look at Houston, they've gone under the total in 7 of 9 games. Did want to get your quick take on that, Payne, because we know Houston loves to be methodical. They love to slow the game down. Total at 145.5. Is it odds makers tipping their hand? Is it a hybrid number? Because you normally don't see totals this low for Arizona, but on the converse, you don't see totals typically this high for Houston, given that they want to try and take their time on the offensive end.
And it's been a little bit of a meshing. And what's interesting is going back to Sasser, hearing some things that if they make it to the Final Four, he'll be available. I would expect more of a bench role, potentially 8 to 12 minutes, which is good for a team that lacks a little bit of depth. But in terms of the total, I've actually seen a battle here. Saw some money come in from someone I respect a ton under 147. Saw some money come in over at 144.5 from someone I talked to on Monday. So there is a little bit of a battle there, and it does come down to these contrasting styles. It feels like if you like Arizona, makes some sense to bet the over because that is kind of the match. If you like Houston, makes some sense to bet this under, and maybe in a game where you don't necessarily feel like there's an edge in price, but you can get that correlation, maybe a correlated money parlay between the two. If you like Houston, you're going Houston and under. If you like Arizona, you're going Arizona and over.
Such a fascinating matchup, and one I think any basketball purist out there, when they saw the brackets unveiled, kind of licked their chops to see this game potentially take hold, and we'll see it in San Antonio. But before we get to that game on Thursday evening, Michigan and Villanova will renew acquaintances, a rematch of the 2018 national title game, a contest where Villanova absolutely dominated.
I hate to cut you off, by the way, but apparently the Jets and Dolphins are in serious talks to trade for Tyreek
How do you
Hill.
feel about that as a Dolphins fan and a Kansas City Chiefs resident homer?
I don't know. This guy called me a homer.
I'm trying to figure.
Schefter's tweeting it now. He makes it sound the way he phrased it like it's a done
I'm trying
deal.
to figure out
if and when the Chiefs trade Tyreek. I guess they couldn't get a deal
Well,
done.
what do they have?
'Cause my understanding was Brett Veach was going to try to get a deal done with Tyreek to help the salary cap situation by inking him to a longer-term deal. And my guess is they can't get a deal done, so one of those new teams would extend him at a rate that he deems worthy. I don't know. Okay,
So,
let's not get too far in advance here. Let's focus on
You know what that
basketball
means?
here. But I just saw that.
A bigger role for my man, Mecole Hardman. It's time to put up or shut up out there as the burner on the outside. Probably not ideal for.
Just what we've always hoped is Juju Smith-Schuster as a number one on the field, and then doing TikTok dances with Jackson off the field.
I wasn't going to say anything, but you took the words right out of my mouth. But we'll go back to basketball. And like we said, it's a rematch of the 2018 national title game. Villanova has two players that remain on their roster from that game, Colin Gillespie and Jermaine Samuels being that tandem, and Eli Brooks on the maize and blue side. This marks Michigan's fifth straight trip to the Sweet 16, seeking their third Elite Eight journey as well. Credit to this program. They've quietly become the model of consistency in a muddled Big Ten. When you look at Michigan, you talked about them being underseeded. I know a lot of people, 14 losses, they don't deserve to be in the field. Well, let's be honest here. It's tied for the most ever for a team entering the Sweet 16, but they showed their mettle battling back from a halftime deficit against Tennessee. When you look at the head coaches in this matchup, I think you have to give a slight nod, or maybe a bigger nod, to Jay Wright. Obviously a level of familiarity. He matched wits in the Big Five games against Phil Martelli's St. Joe's teams back in the day. But when we try and see how this will play out on the basketball court, does Villanova have an answer for Hunter Dickinson on the inside? And is Michigan, potentially without Devontae Jones, have enough at the guard spot to slow down Villanova's penetrate and kick offense?
I think that's the other thing that proves Michigan worthy. I mean, how many teams in this tournament are winning 2 games without their starting point guard in 3 of 4 halves? So that was really telling to me that Michigan was deserving. I'm a Jay Wright guy, so Jay Wright is always going to get the nod over virtually everyone across from him. And I think this game's interesting because it is going to come down to some coaching, right? If you look at pace and transition metrics and possession length, this is a game that's mostly going to be played in the half court on both ends. And it's super cliche, but it does come down to who executes better in the half court, because that's where this game's going to be played. And so it's very obvious, because it's just contrasting styles once they are in the half court. Michigan's are going to run their sets through a guy who's 7'1" and Hunter Dickinson, elite post score, 92nd percentile of post scores. We know Villanova's undersized. Michigan's 12th in the country in near proximity efficiency, and Villanova doesn't have anyone that's bigger than 6'7" on a good day. If you look, teams are shooting over 63% at the rim against Villanova. So I'm really interested to see what Jay Wright comes up with here. Is he going to double Dickinson? Is he going to try and force Dickinson into the middle of the floor where other guards can kind of come down and jab at the ball? You mentioned Devontae Jones. We don't know if he's going to play. He obviously missed the opening round against Colorado State with concussion. Returns against Tennessee, took another hit to the head and missed the second half.
Poor kid, man.
Yeah, you have Frankie Collins, the freshman guard for Michigan. He can really defend, but he's not a reliable shooter from the outside. So if Frankie Collins is in the game, his man is likely who Jay Wright is going to have trap or double Dickinson. So, I think Michigan probably takes too many mid-range jump shots from what I've seen. I've watched the final 6 minutes of Michigan-Tennessee about 10 times. I didn't see a really good set from Michigan's half-court offense the final 5.5 minutes, yet they somehow won, right? A lot of free throws late. You had some putbacks from a bench guy. You had some floaters that were just randomly going in. It wasn't really great half-court sets the final 5.5 minutes against Tennessee. So that would make me a little concerned if this is a half-court game. On the flip side, Michigan's perimeter defense isn't very good. But again, it does probably improve a little bit with Frankie Collins. But Villanova is going to put Dickinson in conflict. Ball screens, they're going to force him to switch. They're going to force him to defend a little bit more on the perimeter. If you look at Michigan, they're outside the top 100 in defending the 3. They're terrible defending dribble shoot situations. As for, as much advantage as Dickinson has in the post on the other end of the court, I think Villanova's guards are substantially bigger than Michigan, so it wouldn't shock me to see Jay Wright use Gillespie in the post to initiate offense that way as well. This game is super tight, right? Feels like 5 is the right number. We saw early bettors lay 4 on Nova. If it gets to 6 and Devontae Jones is cleared, I think we see Michigan money, knowing Villanova doesn't really run and hide when facing this level of competition. And that's ultimately what kept me off Villanova a little bit. If you look at their last 9 opponents that are power rated inside our top 60, Nova's only outscored those opponents by a grand total of 37 points. That includes a 10-point win against Ohio State, who were only down 5 before Kyle Young left with another head injury. So very tight games. I know Villanova does a great job late extending these leads with how well they shoot free throws, but Michigan's great preventing teams from getting to the charity stripe. So this to me at this price is very short, but if you got out and laid Villanova -4 and Devontae Jones is ruled out, you're going to feel great. If you let this thing leak to 6 and you get word that Devontae Jones is in before the market realizes that, you probably feel okay taking Michigan +6. So again, it's a lot about price, and we do have a point guard injury that probably is significant in a game like this.
Yeah, I think you raise an excellent point talking about the value and the importance of every half point for a team that shoots the ball as well from the foul line as Villanova does. Not only are they good by this year's standards, they have a chance to be the best free throw shooting team that we've ever seen in the history of college basketball. So it's very easy in that final minute. A one-possession game quickly goes from 3 to 5 to 7 and changes the dynamic completely. So all those little things for numbers that are razor sharp this time of year that have to kind of factor into some of the handicap. That's one region on Thursday night that we'll see taking place in San Antonio. There are 2 games as well out at the Chase Center in San Francisco. And the first game in that tandem will be the Arkansas Razorbacks taking on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Gonzaga, a 9-point favorite at FanDuel Sportsbook. Total on the game sits at 154.5. First ever all-time meeting in the NCAA tournament between these programs. Only the second meeting ever. And you can't take anything away from an Arkansas team that finished the season like a house on fire. 17-3 straight up in their final 20 games, 14-5-1 against the spread in their last 20. When you dig into some of the numbers against New Mexico State, it was far from a Picasso. Arkansas, 14 field goals made in that game compared to 22 free throws. They shot a robust 27.5% from the floor. It was actually the worst field goal percentage in an NCAA tournament win since Loyola Chicago shot 27.4%. Way back, Payne, when you were a toddler in 1963 national title game. Arkansas, 317th in the country, shooting from deep this season. Meanwhile, Gonzaga, 2 very close calls, needed a second-half comeback against Memphis and needed to put their foot on the accelerator in their round 1 game against Georgia State. When you look at this particular matchup, Payne, is some of the bloom off the rose for the SEC, or are there causes for concern for Gonzaga being unable to put away what should have been inferior teams, so to speak?
That's the tough part about this game. And I think it's really interesting because obviously you've been beaten up over your stance on Arkansas.
They're still coming at me. They're still coming at me.
Yeah. And listen, right? Everyone feels like they're right in their assessment because Arkansas is advancing. So the homers and the fans are like, yeah, Arkansas is awesome. Pro bettors keep talking about how overrated they are. And those guys continue cashing tickets, fading them, right? Like you're looking at Arkansas winning 2 games by a total of 9 points, 0-2 against the spread versus a 13 and a 12 seed, right? They haven't really done much here. Arkansas also doesn't have depth. They struggle to shoot. The straw that stirs the drink in J.D. Notte seemingly can't stay out of foul trouble. And I think he's vital in a game like this because I do think the one area where Gonzaga is a little bit vulnerable is their guards defensively. They do allow some penetration. But there was value on Gonzaga at open based on perception of struggling with Georgia State and Memphis. And meanwhile, the 2 things we discussed in the last podcast and know is Georgia State, now that they were healthy, more like a 13 seed with our power ratings, and Memphis at full strength were playing to the 3rd best power rating from January 27th onward. Committee did Gonzaga no favors. And that's something I mentioned, I think, at the top of this podcast a little bit with Gonzaga is I think outscoring Memphis in the second half by 14 pays dividends down the road. I really do. Like Gonzaga's been tested now. That was the question we had about adjusting to athleticism that Gonzaga does not see in conference. And I think that's been answered. And if you go back to last season's championship game against Baylor and you look at kind of Drew Timmy's performance, he seemed intimidated by Baylor's size and their athleticism and their strength. And through the first 20 minutes against Memphis, Timmy was non-existent. And I said to myself, it's happening again. Gonzaga's getting punked. Well, they overcame that in the second half. And if you caught wind of Drew Timmy's halftime speech, which he mentioned in the postgame, He effectively said, we need to stop playing soft. Obviously not in those words. And then Timmy came
This is a
out
family-friendly
and
show, Payne. I appreciate
Yes.
you exercising discretion.
Yes. And so you look at Timmy and how he came out in the second half, and his hair was on fire, and he led by example. So it feels like they've kind of overcome the athletic, bigger, stronger guys, and they're mentally over that hurdle, if you get where I'm going. If you look at some of the matchups, Arkansas likes to get out in transition. Gonzaga does a very good job taking care of the ball. 14 turnovers the first 2 games inside this tournament, and then they're top 30 in turnovers this season. So probably not a lot of cheap points off turnovers for Arkansas here. The Hogs don't shoot it well from outside. They take a good amount of mid-range jumpers and near proximity shots. Gonzaga, top 30 defending mid-range jumpers, 3rd defending near proximity shots. Only 49% of shots Gonzaga faces at the rim are made. Really, if you look at how Gonzaga is defending down the stretch, their defensive rating has continued to climb. So defensively, they're peaking at the right time. We saw a respected group lay 8 at open, and then a public bettor that gets market respect laid 8.5 on Monday. It's why we're out to 9 now. And even as we record, a lot of 9.5 starting to pop. There's also travel and home court advantage for Gonzaga here. If you think about this trek, and I know we're all envisioning fancy chartered planes and these kids sipping champagne on the way there, but there still is a travel element here. And so you had Arkansas go from home to Buffalo, back to Arkansas, now out to San Francisco. Gonzaga hasn't left the Pacific time zone since February 5th for a trip to BYU. So I think that's somewhat relevant here. The Zags certainly are going to have fans in the stands with this being played in San Francisco. Maybe a little circadian element with this being a late tip as well, Todd.
Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned Drew Timme. I think it goes without mentioning that he's played his best basketball in the second halves of these games. 43 of his 57 points so far this tournament have come in the second half when Gonzaga has needed him to be at his absolute best. He's now the all-time leading scorer as far as Gonzaga players are concerned in the NCAA tournament, 179 points in 8 career games. And all of this breakdown comes without a single mention of Chet Holmgren, who has been one of the best in terms of altering shots inside the paint. First player since blocks became official back in 1986 with 15 plus points, 15 plus rebounds, 5 plus assists, and 5 plus blocks in an NCAA tournament game. Now, granted, he may need to put on a little bit of bulk for that to translate to the next level, but for a team that's, again, like Arkansas, it's a little bit undersized in the interior, it could create some problems as they look to get some of those easy buckets. Arkansas, Gonzaga, Payne, the early game out west, and arguably maybe the best game of a loaded Thursday slate from a basketball standpoint, will take place Thursday night between Texas Tech and Duke. And it's the Red Raiders, a 1-point favorite despite being the lower seeded team in this matchup. Total in this game sits at 137 at FanDuel Sportsbook. First meeting in the tournament between these two programs, second meeting all time as they played once back in 2018. Obviously on paper, from a coaching experience standpoint, it's a little bit of a mismatch. Coach K seeking his 100th career win in the tournament. Mark Adams seeking his 3rd. Coach K, the most Sweet 16 and most Elite 8 appearances of any coach in college basketball. When you look at these teams, though, I don't want to oversimplify the handicap because I know we have to look at both sides of the ball. Texas Tech, the best in defensive efficiency, 7th in points per game allowed, 4th in field goal percentage. Meanwhile, they'll go up against a Duke offense that's top 5 in offensive efficiency, 8th in points per game, 6th in field goal percentage. And we know we're looking at players that'll move on to the next level. Duke has 5 guys projected to go in the top 40. Texas Tech, not quite the same level of NBA experience, but here we are with Tech, a modest 1-point favorite.
Yeah, the number is certainly interesting here. I envisioned it opening a little bit differently, but certainly a stance has been taken at this point. And the game, to me, is really intriguing because it's strength on strength. Duke has one of the most efficient offenses, despite not really running anything complex. It's just about talent and athletes. And Texas Tech's defense is number 1 in the country. And they're also both trending in adjusted efficiency as being number 1 in offense and number 1 in defense. It's really a fun matchup from that perspective. When you look at Duke, right, it's about the talent and the athletes, which you mentioned, 5 potential picks in the top 40. And without running anything of substance on offense, they're averaging 119 points per 100 possessions. But something's got to give because Tech's allowing 83 points per 100 possessions. Ultimately, for me, the way officials call this end of the court is the biggest factor. You know, the way Texas Tech wants to defend you, they can be really handsy. And I think that's the real X factor when Duke's your opponent and they're already getting most 50-50 calls in normal situations, but now every game is potentially Coach K's last. So that does become somewhat worrisome in a pick'em like game. So I think that's probably the first thing, is how this game is officiated. The second is, can Duke hit jumpers? Texas Tech is like super old school in that they pack the paint. They shut the middle of the court down. They cut off driving lanes. And they're very good one-on-one defenders. And Tech basically forces you to shoot from outside. And there was a good nugget that I heard, and I don't have the kid's name, but he tweeted out that Texas Tech this season's played 24 unique opponents. 17 of those 24 had their lowest scoring output in the paint. And if you look, it makes sense. Texas Tech is number 1 in the country in near proximity attempts allowed. They're number 4 in defending those near proximity shots. Now, if you look at Duke, they have the size to shoot over the top. You have Banchero at 6'10". He can knock down some jumpers. You have Moore and Griffin, both 41% plus from the outside. Jeremy Roach has been a nice contributor lately, helping Duke space the floor a little bit. I just hope the refs swallow the whistle, because if they do, we know what Tech is capable of defensively, and you have this added prep time. And I think they can make life difficult for Duke offensively if they go hero ball mode, which we have seen pretty much throughout the course of this season. But kind of going back to this price, and that's kind of where the problem lies for me, Todd. I expected the game to open Duke -2. But unfortunately, you know, in college basketball, there's very few real odds makers, and most just copy Ken Palm. So Tech opens -1. And to me, that is also bookmakers taking a stance as well. And I would envision this being one-way traffic come game day from recreational bettors on Duke. So it will be really interesting to see where this fluctuates, right? Again, it'll be telling potentially if, you know, Duke ends up closing a favorite, although not a ton of money required to go through the 0, but a little bit more in basketball. If Tech moves out to 2, very, very telling. What is interesting to me, though, is there was this common opponent in Notre Dame. And I know Duke played Notre Dame about 6 weeks ago. Tech played them a couple days ago. But Duke was a 6-point favorite at Notre Dame, and we have Notre Dame's home court worth about 3.5 points. So you're looking at 9.5 on a neutral. We just saw Tech close 6.5 on a neutral to Notre Dame last round. Yet again, odds makers open this Tech -1 against Duke. So, you know, there's a stance being taken here. There's no doubt about that. There is odds makers really trusting some of the analytic minds in basketball, and that's how you arrive at a number that really is giving you no favors if you want to back Tech. But I also get it because there is another side of this coin, in that Duke just has not looked good recently. You know, you lose the finale at Cameron. You trail to an undermanned Syracuse team 78-77 with 3 minutes to go. You sneak by Miami, although that looks like a better win now than it did at the time. You get pummeled by Vatek, who got bounced in round 1. You fail to cover against Fullerton, no matter how fluky the last second dunk was. You trail to a really bad version of Michigan State by 5 with 4.5 minutes to go, laying 7, and now we're here. Listen, if Tech forces Duke to be a jump shooting team where they can't rely on their athleticism as much, and you get a fair whistle, and Tech does enough offensively against a Duke team that's 166th in adjusted defensive efficiency the last 10 games, and Tech's motion offense gives Duke some trouble, then Tech probably wins this game and they're advancing. But there are some hurdles that you certainly have to overcome.
Are you confident that Tech can make enough shots? I know, obviously, I'm asking the simple overriding question here, because if we believed in Tech's offense, then this game becomes a runaway. Bryson Williams, Kevin O'Banner, so much going to be expected of them. Do we think Duke can solidify its defense, or, hey, look, they've given us a full body of work. There's no reason to believe they can fix all that ails on the defensive end going into a game of this magnitude?
I think it's tough. Obviously, you have the players that if they buy in, they can defend. right? If you look at their one-on-one defense, it's not bad. They have an ability to guard without fouling, which is something Texas Tech does rely on, getting to the free throw line. It just becomes what transpires here in the next 4 days preparing for this game. There's no reason a team that talented can't defend, right? None whatsoever. And you see in moments where it's late in the Michigan State game, they're able to get some stops. They just don't have that intensity or will or want for the entire stretch of the game. And maybe now that these games are a little bit more impactful, we'll see that defensive effort. I had a conversation with Brad on Monday, and he pointed out something that was very interesting. This is typically not a spot where Duke has had success under Coach K. 0-5 in the tournament, playing on the West Coast. This game, obviously, is going to be played in San Francisco. Texas Tech, correct me if I'm wrong, was just playing out in the West Coast last round.
Yep.
So there is some
Out
familiarity.
in San Diego in that last against Montana State and their win over Notre Dame. And I think that's part of the reason that when you look at, this game, it's so fascinating for a variety of reasons. But you've heard enough from the two of us. It's probably time to introduce a new voice, as we'll call it a de facto halftime of sorts, as we've covered all 4 games for Thursday and 4 games still on tap for Friday. He joins us every week during the course of the football season, and he's so gracious enough to spend a little time with us until they crown a national champion on the college basketball hardwoods. You can follow John Sheeran on Twitter, at J Sheeran. That's JSHEERAN1981. And John, have to ask you, like we do each and every week during the football season, good or bad opening weekend for the house?
Really good 4 days, I would say, so far in the tournament. Todd, it's been really interesting to see the demand for the content and really encouraging. I think overall the growth has been phenomenal. I think I said, most of the games in the first couple of rounds were akin to like a 1 p.m. NFL game. I think our handle over the 4 days already has been double what we took on the 2 weeks of the Super Bowl. So huge demand. Our hold percentage has been quite solid. We got enough upsets and covers where we needed them for it to be, almost double figures in terms of hold percentage so far on the game. So really encouraging start so far for the book, unfortunately.
Always crazy to hear that for the recreational bettor who automatically assumes Super Bowl is the single most important event. And I think in some contexts that's obviously true for the sports books. But to your point, the sheer volume of games that the college basketball tournament will offer, the 48 from Thursday to Sunday, obviously allow people to churn their money through. And for those folks that have been out to Vegas and spent the better part of 72, 96 hours, they know as soon as those games go final, that money is getting rebet on something else. When you look ahead to the round of 16, we know there are 15 games left this college basketball season as far as the big tournament is concerned. Do you expect that volume to consolidate a little bit more, or do you feel that some of the allure as the menu shrinks kind of goes away and the handle won't be anything close to what we've seen so far?
I think it'll consolidate for sure, but I think those games are a broader appeal. I look at the handle so far in some of the games that are being played tomorrow, and it's really high already. So, I'm encouraged by what we've seen so far, and I think, obviously less games left, but I do think that they'll draw bigger audiences, and for that reason, bigger betting public as well. So excited to see what it looks like.
So to kind of contextualize, and again, not to put words in your mouth, going from, a lot of those games being like a 1 p.m. kickoff on Sunday, Sweet 16, Elite 8, more like a standalone Sunday night football or Monday night perhaps, or are we talking NFL playoff handle the way things are trending?
It's hard to tell because I can't compare year on year because the business is just so different. We didn't have New York this time last year, for example. And there's still inherent growth on some of the existing states that have been live for 3 or 4 years, like New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So it's very hard to kind of see where they're getting to. But the numbers right now are certainly as high as what we would have seen in the NFL primetime games a day out or 2 days out. So encouraged to see what it looks like and obviously be able to kind of give you more context next week.
Payne, I have to ask John one other question before I let you hit him with the hard-hitting stuff for some of the game specifics coming up this weekend. And that, of course, John, would be about the storyline brewing with St. Peter's. We know that when you look at the Peacocks, they came in as major long shots in the tournament. But I think the other part that a lot of our listeners may not quite be able to grasp, depending on what states they're listening from, the state of New Jersey, where St. Peter's is located in Jersey City, can't actually take bets on the Peacocks. Has that mitigated some of the liability you guys have seen, or is it a team that you have a quote-unquote legitimate sweat, knowing it's still an uphill battle, but at the same time, there's a massive red figure potentially hanging over their heads?
I think all of that. First and foremost, yeah, it's obviously unfortunate given the storyline and the way they've played through the first 2 rounds. They've obviously captured the imagination, and certainly that's translated into the betting public getting active on them at huge prices. I think we're 350 to 1 right now on them to win the tournament. By the end of today, we'll probably have a red figure, as you call it, of about $50 million on them, despite customers not being able to bet on them in the second biggest state that we're live in, and their home state, New Jersey. We know that people can travel very short distances to be able to get to New York and wager on them through that, and we've already seen almost 20% of the volume that we've taken on St. Peter's has come from New Jersey customers who had to travel out of state to wager on them. So look, it's not ideal. It's the way the legislation was written. It's the hand the regulator was dealt. So, not throwing any muddy water on anybody. Obviously not ideal. And I think it has dampened it a little bit in New Jersey. But overall, an incredible story. I'd love to see them get another win. And they won't become a sweat until their price drops a lot, should that happen. I mean, right now we have it about a 0.14% chance of them winning the tournament. So no sweat just yet, Todd.
Payne, John may be the only bookmaker, and it's why he's kind of earned the mantra of being the Robin Hood of bookmakers, that actually roots for that liability to get closer, because he wants that sweat. He wants that adrenaline there. And if St. Peter's were to get to the Final Four, I feel like John would be the most entertaining guy to be sitting next to while he sweats out what potentially could be the most tense 80 minutes of basketball if the Peacocks were able to do the unthinkable.
He's a horse player. So St. Peter's potentially getting to the Final Four is like the home stretch for him. Give him a nice little sweat. You guys have to be feeling good about that liability, correct?
That's what I said. Like our worlds, like yours, revolves around probability, and when it's something is a 0.14% chance in our estimation of happening, we won't worry about it just yet.
No doubt about it. And when we get to these 8 games on Thursday and Friday, what have you seen potentially in terms of your in-house guys having a discrepancy with the market? Anything there that you guys have discussed as a team saying, wow, this is a little bit off from the market price?
Not really. I mean, most of the lines have kind of consolidated around where we would have expected them to be. I think we spoke last week about the teams, that we were for and against, and I think to some degree you'll see an element of that expressed in where we sit, particularly in things like the outrights. Houston, certainly a team that we are still kind of adverting. I think we're plus 850. You can get 10 to 1 out there. That's obviously a team we like. We liked Arizona, but obviously, at plus 650 right now, we actually, given our position on Houston, we think that that's a fair price. And then, the others really just kind of are kind of sitting where we expected them to be. So not a whole lot in terms of line opinion this week anyway.
And in terms of potentially sharp money sides or totals across the 8 games, have you guys seen anything come into this point?
It's been reasonably heavy on the public side so far, Payne. Not really something that I could offer up. Obviously, with a lot of the unders hitting in the last round, I think there's been a preference for some of that. Particularly in the likes of the Texas Tech game. I think they'll be able to do a decent job on Duke's offense. And, we didn't like Duke, as you knew from last week, and that still remains the case. So that's certainly one that we're leaning towards, both the under and Texas Tech on that side.
Makes complete sense. And you mentioned that public money coming in terms of what you've taken so far. Let's remove St. Peter's from that equation because we've already discussed them. But is there any liability where you guys are going to be rooting for a specific side, knowing where the action's coming in or where you anticipate it to come in now over the next 24 to 48 hours?
Yeah, look, Duke have been very popular. I think when we spoke last week, we'd taken a couple of big bets on them outright at 17 to 1. One was in the rounds of $200,000 or $250,000 at 17 to 1, and that money has continued to come. We've taken more than double the money on anybody else on Duke. They are over an $8 million loser in the book as I look at it right now. North Carolina have certainly captured everyone's imagination. 2 impressive performances for them. And I think UCLA probably the other one in the outright as well that people have gravitated towards as they've kind of got back to the form that showed them up so well last year. We have a little bit of an upside down book, but that doesn't surprise me in terms of the opinions that we kind of laid out last week. Gonzaga are actually our best result in the entire book, despite us being clear best price on them in the outright right now.
You've transitioned me to another question before I kick it back to Todd here. You mentioned North Carolina and UCLA. Have you guys had an internal discussion on what Jaime Jaquez means to the price and if he's upgraded?
Yeah, I mean, the guys will have considered that as they sorted the line out. Obviously, the ankle injury, not great. Interesting to see how that trends over the next the next few hours. But yeah, the guys will certainly have considered that in the line, probably a point or point and a half, I would have thought, in terms of what he was worth.
So many interesting storylines when you look at the Thursday schedule. Obviously, a significantly more attractive slate on paper than what you have Friday night, although you guys did touch on the marquee matchup that'll go into the late night between North Carolina and UCLA, of course. One other question for me, John, before we bid you a fond farewell. As the schedule condenses and we get to fewer and fewer games, a lot of our players have asked, can we expect more of a individual player offering? I know individual states are a little bit different. Do you guys have plans to expand your player prop offering as early as the Elite Eight, or most likely not until the Final Four and we know the 4 combatants headed to New Orleans?
I think we've had a decent level of prop offering for players. We already have player performance doubles up for all of the games, first basket, top point scorer to score X plus, as well as their standard over-under performances in points, rebounds, assists, made threes. So there's already a decent offering up there, I would say. We've obviously paid close attention to the growth in this space, and we continue to kind of focus on development. We've had the new bot model delivered this season. We're I believe the first operator to take in-house trading of college basketball away from a supplier. And we're able to build out a lot of those player level markets as a result, and they're all now outputs from that model. So I expect us to have, a very broad offering, and I think we have already just looking at the site. So we'll expand on it for sure next year, hopefully do a better job of delivering a similar same game parlay experience as well to the NBA, particularly as you mentioned in those states where we're permitted to do player props at the collegiate level.
You can follow John on Twitter at J Sheeran. That's JSHEERAN 1981. And John, we may have to introduce a component of video footage should we see a Final Four matchup next weekend between St. Peter's and Gonzaga, at least to get a 2 to 3 minute hit that would circulate on Bet the Board. But in the meantime, best of luck this weekend. Thanks for the contributions, and we'll look forward to chatting with you same time next week when we know who the Final Four is.
Thank you, Todd. If they make the Final Four, we'll have a peacock in here in the office with the traders. How about that?
We may have to hold you to that, my friend.
Sounds good.
That's one hell of a storyline that's brewing here, Payne, when you talk about St. Peter's, people in their home state, not being able to bet them. But in the typical world we live in, you can take a 3-minute train ride, go into the state of New York, and put down as much money as you'd possibly like on the Peacocks.
Common sense. Not all that common.
No, apparently not, but great perspective as always from John, and we love hearing about how things went for that opening weekend, some of their takeaway. And like I said, I said it tongue-in-cheek, but I may need a live video feed if it's St. Peter's against Gonzaga in the Final Four, should those two teams be doing battle, knowing that the book has taken a pretty strong stance against both of them. But before we get there, we have 4 more games to get through, and of course, the marquee game on Friday night is the Battle of Blue Bloods between North Carolina and UCLA. That'll be the late game coming to you from Philadelphia. And when you look at these two programs, 37 Sweet 16 appearances for each of these Blue Bloods. UNC looking to get to the Elite Eight for the 27th time in program history. Hubert Davis deserves a ton of credit. This is a coaching job that, I'll be honest, I didn't think was quite possible. North Carolina finds a way to get through Marquette. They withstand a late rush from Baylor, blowing a 25-point lead after Brady Manick is ejected for that flagrant 2 foul. But Hubert will join Bill Guthridge in getting North Carolina to the Sweet 16 in his first season, the only head coaches to accomplish such a feat. And when you look at the Heels, part of their success so far this dance has been their proficiency from deep, 24 of 60 from beyond the arc, en route to back-to-back 90-point explosions. Meanwhile, UCLA, hey, look, we can give you all the numbers. We can talk about the ATS trends, but the biggest storyline brewing here will be around the availability of Jaime Jaquez, who is arguably UCLA's best defender, and coming into this contest, should he be available, has compiled 10 straight games in double figures, including 15 in St. Mary's until he was ruled out with about 7 minutes to go. And he's really picked up where Johnny Juzang has left off, as Juzang has dealt with a fair share of injuries himself down the stretch.
I think that's the best way to discuss this game and the pricing of it. And, we know the line is short. It's short for a reason. You mentioned Jaime Jaquez sprained ankle late in the St. Mary's game. Very questionable. Hasn't practiced at all. Mick Cronin said at his Tuesday presser that he's made 2 game plans, one with Jaime in, one without him. That was a little different from what Mick Cronin said immediately after the St. Mary's game, where he said if Jaime can walk, he'll play. So he's backpedaled a little bit there. You add that with the fact that this game's being played in Philadelphia, and you see why a game that should be more like 4.5 is like 2.2 right now. And I think this becomes the information game where if you find out Jaime Jaquez is playing before it's factored into the market and you already like UCLA, then you're going on a cheap money line price. If you like North Carolina and you find out Jaime Jaquez is playing, you wait until it's announced and hits the screen so you can get 3 or better. And that's one thing I asked John and completely agree with. He's probably a 1.5 point player. Let's see how strong that 1.5 means, because we know the 2 and the 3 have a ton more value than their actual number's sake. So that will be interesting to see where this goes. This is one game, Todd, where the guys I speak with are all split. And it doesn't really shock me when you have a high variance team like UNC. They're literally 358th in the country in consistency. We know at their peak they can play with anybody and beat anybody. But we also know what it looks like when they're not hitting shots. So that's interesting here. You just never know what you're going to potentially get from North Carolina, because that talent level can reach to being one of the best teams in the country. And there's kind of this double-edged sword where, like, yes, you want your team playing its best at the end of the season, but when you win 8 of 9 games and you build a 25-point lead against Baylor, you would assume their market price is also at peak at this point and there wouldn't be a ton of value. To me, this game is all about price. It's all about the injury, nothing more, nothing less. There are some interesting things here within this game where, UNC doesn't do a very good job defending ball screens. They're also outside the top 300 in allowing mid-range jump shots. That is where UCLA lives. You do wonder if Jaime Jaquez is out, as you mentioned, and Johnny Juzang, who's not 100% at this point, suddenly has Leaky Black on him, who's like the only guy out there. Just, he's there to defend. He's an eraser, right? Can't score, but he's an eraser. So all of a sudden, if Jaime Jaquez isn't out there and Juzang's being locked up by Leaky, then it basically becomes a Jules Bernard game, and he's got to do everything. You also do have this element where, like Mick Cronin teams, we know in the Cincinnati days, they are going to out-physical you. They want to beat you up. And while this still is UCLA, he has toughened those guys. And when you go back to when UNC was actually struggling, they were getting beat up. They were getting out-muscled. They were getting out-physicaled. So to me, this game just has a ton of variance within itself. And then when you add the injuries on top of it, it's very difficult unless you have that information to enter the market, in my opinion.
You mentioned Jules Bernard, and I think he's really picked his game up as late. You look at his offensive rating, better than 111 in 7 of his last 8 games. Meanwhile, Tiger Campbell becomes the X factor, the consummate floor general. He has that experience. We know he's not prone to turning the ball over, but can he take on the scoring mantra if Johnny Juzang is locked up, if Jaime Jaquez isn't available? So many interesting elements in this particular spot. But you do wonder, Mick Cronin against Hubert Davis, big stage as UNC play loose and free with a little bit of house money. Meanwhile, UCLA has that edge and experience, having been there and done that. I think a tremendous game in Philadelphia. But like we talked about for so many of the earlier games, you can't discount the travel factor, as UCLA will be crisscrossing the country for this particular ball game. But before we get to that game on Thursday night, you have a Cinderella on full display, where I'm sure the St. Peter's alumnus group will make the pilgrimage from across the East Coast in Jersey City to see their beloved Peacocks, who will open up as 12.5-point underdogs against Purdue. Total in this game, 135 at FanDuel. And when you look at the Peacocks, they've been one of the best teams in the country against the spread this year, going 23-9, so clearly exceeding odds makers' expectations. 9 straight wins and covers. It's actually the longest winning streak in the country right now. But the one thing that St. Pete's going to have to overcome, should they be successful, not necessarily to win this game outright, but to cover as a double-digit dog. What kind of approach can Shaheen Holloway have for defending the size, the length, and the athleticism that Purdue is going to provide, which is significantly different than what St. Peter sees on a nightly basis throughout the Metro Athletic Conference?
Pray. I mean, this is where things end for St. Peter's. Great story. Fantastic. You love it for the school. You love it for the kids. You love it for Shaheen Holloway, who's going to parlay it into the Seton Hall job. We had St. Peter's power rated outside the top 160 coming into this tournament. And I kind of hinted at this at the top, but we saw Kentucky dominate inside. Purdue should have similar success inside and from the free throw line. The problem was Kentucky couldn't hit shots from the outside, couldn't hit their free throws. Purdue is going to hit those. And again, St. Peter's, great story, but I kind of harped on this at the top. It's like these 40-minute samples in the swingiest sport there is are super relevant. Because if you look at the advanced box score based on shot quality, Kentucky was a 22-point winner over St. Peter's. They lost by 6. St. Peter's, a 10-point winner against Murray State, lost that game in the advanced box score as well. Purdue is going to dominate in the paint. You have Zach Edey, you have Travion Williams, Purdue's top 5 in the country in near proximity shooting efficiency. They're number 1 in second chance conversion percentage. And St. Peter's, outside the top 300 in 2-point efficiency defense, outside the top 225 in points scored within 5 seconds of an offensive rebound. It's not good. It's not a good matchup. And because St. Peter's is so undersized, they're outside the top 350 in free throw rate allowed. So if Purdue isn't getting easy twos at the rim, they're going to live at the foul line. If Shaheen Holloway decides to double the post, Edey and Williams are so tall, they should be able to kick it out pretty easily, and you have a Purdue team top 5 in 3-point efficiency. It's obviously not a good matchup. That is why the spread is this high. Offensively, Peters can't score in the paint. 341 in near proximity shots. They don't play against 2 7-footers in the Metro Atlantic. St. Peter's is going to be reliant on 3 balls. And if you look at Peters, they were 6th in their own conference in effective field goal percentage. Again, it just doesn't really translate here. Now, they do a very good job getting second chance points by crashing the glass and kicking out for 3. Again, that probably works in the Metro. Against Purdue, top 15 in rebounding their own defensive glass. So that's probably not going to be a factor. Purdue isn't a great defensive team. Let's make no bones about that. They have holes. Their guards have trouble stopping penetration. They don't do a great job defending the 3-ball. You kind of look at the game against Texas, and somehow Purdue gives up 71 points. Meanwhile, Texas only shot 9 free throws and were held scoreless for 10 minutes. That's tough to fathom when those two combinations happen, okay? But that's really the only way Peters stays in this game, is if they're hitting from the outside at the end of the shot clock in a very slow-paced game, if refs are letting their 6'6", 6'7" bigs hang all over Edey and Williams, if Purdue has defensive lapses, if the home court advantage kicks in. Other than that, the line feels pretty right at 12.5.
Can I ask you a question? And I always hate to put you on the spot, but I'm going to do it anyways. If Purdue and Kentucky coming into the tournament, if they were playing on a neutral, that number where Kentucky -1 or right around a pick 'em, I'm not sure how bullish you guys were on the Wildcats compared to the Boilermakers. I know it's, again, not an apples to apples comparison, but when you look at Kentucky, they close an 18.5, 19-point favorite against St. Peter's. St. Peter's profile raised with back-to-back victories, but here we are looking at Purdue, only a 12.5-point favorite in the spot.
Yeah, thinking about Kentucky not actually losing to St. Peter's and what that power profile would mean, I think you're actually a little bit lower than that. We have Kentucky power rated a little bit higher than I think some of the metrics. We had them power rated 4th. We have Purdue power rated 11th. I think you're looking at Kentucky -2 there as an open.
Okay. That's kind of what I assumed. And it's always interesting when you look at the tournament setting and try and figure out how, odds makers have to adjust.
Now, if this game was played at the beginning of the season, vastly different, right? Kentucky wasn't really defending at the beginning portion of the season, and Purdue looked like a team that could cut down the nets. And that's kind of the interesting part about Purdue, is based upon some of their guys being a little bit more veteran-laden and having Painter, who's a fantastic coach. A team like that comes out of the gates a little bit faster, but when you start to figure them out, their power profile did start to dwindle towards the end of the season. But they're here, right? And you get this upset where St. Peter's knocks down Kentucky, and now all of a sudden the one is out at the top of the region, and Purdue can very easily make the Final Four.
Yeah, it's one of those teams that's interesting because, to your point, with the level of familiarity we saw in Big Ten play, teams appeared to have figured out Purdue from a point spread perspective. They went roughly a month without covering a single number. That no longer the case, as they blasted Yale in their opener, followed it up with a win over Texas where they were able to extend late. 3 regions.
If you're just looking, honestly, if you're just looking at Purdue on a sheet of paper, and you start to think about the actual players, there are very few teams in the country that have 2 7-footers that shoot from 3 at a top 5 rate and have a lottery pick. They're scary when it all comes together.
It's not a bad recipe in this day and age, especially against a mid-major that I don't believe, to my knowledge, has anybody bigger than 6'7" that they'll trot out there. So full marks to Shaheen Holloway and Cinderella. Not quite sure this run can continue, but to your point, first time that a college basketball program from the state of New Jersey has made the Sweet 16 since Shaheen Holloway's Seton Hall Pirates pulled off the feat back in 2000. As we know, everything seems to come full circle. 6 games down, 2 to go, and we'll shift our attention to the Midwest and Chicago, where the United Center will inevitably be Jayhawks East, as you have to imagine Kansas fans will flood the building for their matchup against the Providence Friars, and it's Kansas, a 7.5-point favorite at FanDuel Sportsbook. Total in this game, 141.5. Obviously, head coaching, a major disparity as far as experience is concerned. Bill Self been here and done that. Ed Cooley takes Providence to their first Sweet 16 since 1997. To the Friars' credit, it was their largest win and fewest points allowed as far as a tournament game was concerned over Richmond. Finished plus 36 from beyond the arc, holding the Spiders to just 1 of 22 from deep. Meanwhile, Kansas, they're into the Sweet 16 for the first time since 2018. They did finish with a major edge in paint points and rebounding advantage in slipping by a pesky Creighton team. Payne, everybody and their brother wanted to talk about how lucky Providence was coming into the dance. Suddenly, the Friars win 2 games against Richmond and South Dakota State, and the public can't get themselves enough of the regular season Big East champion.
Really interesting dynamic. We both liked Providence in the opening round. We wanted to fade some of that luck narrative. The line felt like it was a little short, and there was a group that agreed and laid Providence Thursday morning. But I don't think Providence win against Richmond is as impressive as it looks on paper, winning by 28. You look at Richmond playing its 6th game in 9 days. The last thing you want to do is play this physical bully in Providence, which they are. They play that role very well. And then again, the anomaly shooting performance. There's, again, just so much variance in these games. But if you look based on shot quality, Providence lost that game against Richmond. Now, I don't believe that was actually the case, but Richmond's 1 for 22 from 3. They shot 38% from the free throw line on 21 attempts. If that doesn't yell tired legs 6 games in 9 days, I don't know what does. On the flip side, Kansas took monster money against Creighton from the biggest bettor and other bettors, and that game got sent from Kansas 9.5 out to 13. Back to variance, though, right? Creighton hits 12 threes. Creighton has 4 more 3-point plays in the game, so 16 threes altogether, and Kansas still wins by 7. What I have seen and heard on this game to this point is most people I respect don't think Kansas is good, and they're probably not playing to a normal 1-seed level. That even with Providence and all their luck, they felt 8.5 was too high. Respected money took Providence plus 8.5. Now, anytime this has gotten to 7, which is a relevant number, we see it back to 7.5 pretty quickly. There are a few things that stand out here. Kansas offensively trending better down the stretch with Remy Martin in the mix. Providence allows you to get inside. And while they do a good job defending once you get inside, Kansas is a different animal. They're athletic. They're talented. more than what Providence typically sees. And so they're 14th in near proximity efficiency. So if you're allowing Kansas to get there, I think they're good enough, they're skilled enough, they're talented enough to actually make you pay a little bit more than what teams have typically made Providence pay once you let them inside. So if you're letting Kansas get inside, I think they can do some damage there. We saw Richmond actually score pretty much at will inside against Providence. The other thing we have to be aware of in this matchup is Providence is horrific getting back on defense. And it feels like this is an Ed Cooley thing at this point, back-to-back seasons. Providence has allowed its opponents to attempt more than 30% of shots in transition. We know Kansas wants to get in out and run. And they want to run off rebounds. They want to run off your makes. That's where Kansas is at its best. So for me, the entire key to this game is two things. And they correlate. Can Providence continue hitting threes? They take a bunch of them. In terms of shot distance, Providence is 195 in the country in proximity. So lots of shots away from the basket. If those shots are falling, great. But if they're not, and Kansas can rebound the long miss and get out in transition, not good for Providence. It's really hard to envision Ed Cooley watching Kansas film, and that is not the point of emphasis all week, on getting back on defense. But at the end of the day, the number matters, and to this point, the bettors that matter took 8.5 on Providence. Let's see if that changes. Let's see if there's a different sentiment as it gets back potentially to 7 as limits rise a little bit more. That'll be pretty telling. But again, it just comes down, and we say this a lot of time, there's a lot of variance in this game. Providence hitting their threes. If they're not, then we're going to get some runouts from Kansas, and this could snowball a little bit more than potentially what the numbers would indicate.
Hey, to Providence's credit, this is a team that has shown veteran leadership and being able to take advantage of close games, making all the shots when they matter most. We've seen them at their best, or maybe not quite, in back-to-back wins so far in this tournament, but it was only 3 games ago where they were absolutely embarrassed by the Creighton Blue Jays, being outscored 30-2 over an extended stretch in the Big East tournament. So we know Providence, a wide margin of results. We'll see if the Jayhawks are able to attack them inside, creating opportunities on the perimeter for Kansas to knock down some big jumpers. The final game, Payne, that we have to break down, of course, also taking place in Chicago on Friday evening, showcases a pair of Cinderellas hailing from power conferences. It's Iowa State as an 11 seed taking on Miami as a 10 seed. It's the Miami Hurricanes, a 2.5-point favorite at FanDuel Sportsbook. Total on the game sits at 133. It's the 5th ever Sweet 16 meeting of double-digit seeds. The last 2 to play in the Elite 8 actually went on to advance to the Final 4. Third appearance for the Miami Hurricanes under Jim Larinaga in the Sweet 16. Second time he's made it this far as a double-digit seed. We, of course, know the last time it happened, he took George Mason to the Final 4. Meanwhile, Iowa State, they deserve a ton of credit. The biggest turnaround in college basketball, not only this season, but one of the greatest in history. They won just 2 games a season ago. They've now won 2 games in the NCAA tournament. To Iowa State's credit, they somehow found a way to get to this point in the tournament, despite not scoring 60 points in either of their first 2 games. When you look at Miami, this is a guard-oriented team. It's extremely experienced. Iowa State wants to force turnovers, try and get out in transition, because if the Cyclones are forced to operate in the half court, it hasn't been pretty for an offense that lacks a lot of independent shot makers.
Completely agree with the vibe of what you're saying, and I think you potentially like Miami's matchups a little bit, and I agree. And so this initial movement is not surprising at all. If you look at Iowa State, they struggle down the stretch this season. And then you get LSU in round 1, a team without its head coach, and in comes Kevin Nickelberry as the interim coach for LSU. 96 and 194 as the head coach at Howard. Okay? So not a lot to be had from an interim head coach there. And round 2, Wisconsin starting point guard leaves with an injury at the 5-minute mark of the first half. The Badgers are up 5 at that point. The final 25 minutes without Chucky Hepburn, Wisconsin really couldn't run its offense. But in saying that, their shot quality didn't totally dwindle if you look at those kind of metrics. The advanced box score, it was indicative of a Wisconsin 7-point win, not a 5-point win from Iowa State, despite not having their point guard for the last 25 minutes against a team that likes to pressure the ball and trap and do all these unique things. The opposite is true for Miami, in that despite shooting 4 for 29 combined from 3 against USC and Auburn, the advanced box has Miami winning by 13 in a near pick'em game against USC and by 5 against Auburn as a 7.5-point dog. So what's their peak if they start to hit shots? And this, again, is a variance type tournament. We've seen the better teams go home if they have an off shooting night. Miami's had 2 horrific shooting nights from deep and have dominated both games. Past that, you mentioned some of those matchups. They're a little bit interesting. Miami does play with 4 guards. They don't turn it over. 6th in the country in turnover percentage. Iowa State seems to do better out of conference where their ball pressure and their tricky traps aren't seen as much. I just don't know if that style works against a 4-guard lineup and Jim Larinaga with extended prep time. It works against USC, a team without good guard play. It works against Wisconsin when they have one ball handler and he gets injured with 25 minutes to play. But once Miami's guards get by the ball pressure and get out of these Iowa State traps, it becomes a layup drill at the rim where Iowa State allows nearly 77% of unblocked rim shots to be made. For Iowa State to have a chance, they need to dominate on the inside offensively. Miami, because they play 4 guards and are pretty small, they're outside the top 300 in defending near proximity shots. On shots that aren't blocked, Miami's allowing more than 70% of those rim shots to be made. So that's kind of where this game lies. It's big versus small. It's the year 2022. Guards mean more than big men, and that's just kind of how these things go. To this point, we have seen Miami +1, Miami pick, Miami -1, Miami -1.5. They've all been hit. We're now at 2.5. 2 is a hugely important number in basketball. I think there's a shot to get to 3 here. That's another number with huge relevance. If it does get to that number, my gut says we might see some playback on the Cyclones if you get to 3.5, because this time of year, most people don't think odds makers are off 3.5, 4 points through a 2 and a 3. And that Iowa State has an advantage inside, and that Iowa State plays in the higher-rated conference, and that a team from the Midwest gets to play in the Midwest back-to-back weeks, right? I mean, Iowa State got to play about 5 hours away from home in Milwaukee. Now they're about a 5-hour trip to Chicago. So some of those things will matter to some if this were to get to 3.5, just on the idea that, we're in March now. You can't be 4 points off an opener through the 2 and the 3. So it will be interesting, but ultimately the biggest money I think is hit Miami pretty early in the week here. And if you are someone that really likes Miami and you like the matchups and you've missed the number, you can still shop around. There are some -135s out there on the money line at places that take substantial bets. And that is typically a better price than laying 2.5 in a college basketball game. I should rephrase that. -135 is actually better than laying 2 in college basketball games. And the consensus price right now is Miami -2.5. So, you didn't completely miss the value party if you can find Miami -135. It's not prevalent. It's at a handful of shops, but if that is the way you like this game, that's certainly the substantially better avenue to take than laying 2.
Further to support your pain, talking about your point, Payne, talking about how Miami has faced teams that don't have great ball handlers once Chucky Hepburn went down. Miami has 22 steals so far this tournament through 2 games. They've only turned the ball over twice and had the ball stolen from them. What's that translated into? A 42-5 edge in fast break points. For a team like Iowa State that turns it over a ton and wants to try and turn you over, that may not be the recipe for success. And I think you bring up an excellent point talking about Iowa State, how the travel should be negated going from Milwaukee back home to Ames most likely and then to Chicago. You do wonder as well, in a building like this that will have a strong Kansas presence, would Kansas fans find themselves rooting for a Big 12 team in Iowa State, or would they find themselves rooting for a ACC opponent in Miami, given the fact that I'm sure Kansas, who handled Iowa State, would be just fine in that spot. Miami could pose some interesting challenges. So always some of the unique dynamics when you look to identify a half-point edge here or there on games, to your point, that have such tight margins as we've seen so far in the Big Dance. 8 games.
You know the college landscape better than I do. It feels like they hate everyone in conference until their team is out, and then they root for the conference just to depict that this is the strongest conference in sports. That kind of feels like the vibe, or maybe
no. Generally speaking, that's definitely the case, unless they feel that there's a better matchup. Now, I'm not quite sure if Iowa and Iowa State were playing in the same building or anything along those lines, how things would manifest. But in this particular spot, I do think you root for your conference brethren, and then when you face them on the hardwoods, potentially in an Elite Eight matchup, then you try and beat their brains in and go grab grab bragging rights in that particular spot. So just interesting to think about when you look at a lot of these venues, because I think oftentimes you can find that little intangible in home court advantage that will be out there, and to give yourself an extra boost if you're trying to lean one way or another on some of the games that have such tight numbers. But 8 games broken down to the best of our abilities as eloquently as we know how around these parts. Encourage all of you, our loyal listeners, to follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. You can follow me there as well at Todd Furman. And for those folks who are asking about the college basketball content initially, the best way to get all of the freshest episodes of the Bet the Board podcast, just subscribe to the RSS feed, whether it's Spotify, whether it's SoundCloud, whether it's Apple Podcasts. If you're subscribed to our feed, you'll know the moment one of those podcasts drops, and it's single-handedly the best way to get the information before it's disseminated amongst the masses, especially with an off-season NFL podcast looming in the not-so-distant future. I want to thank John Sheeran, as always, for contributing. But Payne, we do have one final order of business to transact, as we always do, before we bid our listeners a fond farewell into their forays for the Sweet 16 and the Elite Eight. Have you found an opportunity for us to make a few bucks this weekend?
We'll also be back with final.
Oh, yeah, we'll be back by then.
Next week is.
Yeah, that goes without saying, so I apologize for that. And I actually have my days of the week right. Today is Wednesday. We will be back Wednesday with the Final Four podcast, or are we pushing it back a day till Thursday? I just wanted to check.
It's a good question. We'll figure it out. We'll let people know. But it's either coming Wednesday or Thursday.
Sounds good.
I forgot that the games were weekend related there. Yes. Okay. So we've broken down all 8 of these games. I'm sure you've caught some vibes on how we feel about these things. Obviously, we like Gonzaga a little bit, but that's at 8.5. We're now, as we've recorded this, the 9s have disappeared from the market. We're now at like 9.7. There's even a couple 10s out there. Miami, we obviously like that matchup a little bit, but that price is gone. Although if you can find minus 135 on the money line, that's something you will probably continue to beat the closing number on, and there's some nice matchups there. I think we attempt to slay the dragon. Texas Tech, I am just higher on than most people. We made this game Tech -2. I really thought it would come Duke -2, but their struggles down the stretch, their struggles even in victory and how they're winning these games, and the matchup ability that Texas Tech has to clog the paint, to defend dribble penetration, to do really well stopping one-on-one basketball and forcing teams to shoot from the outside. If you get a fair whistle, I think Texas Tech has a really good chance to win this game, even within their struggles on offense. The type of offense they run with the motions have typically given Duke trouble defensively. So let's roll with Texas Tech here. It's kind of a game that we had hoped would come to fruition. I was hoping for a little bit better of a price, but ultimately we have the matchup we want. We have the extended preparation for the better coach. And let's all turn into Red Raider fans on Thursday evening.
See you, Mark.
However, listening to this, by the way, this is one of those weird things, Todd. I have no idea where this line's going to go. Typically, I can tell you where every line's going to go. I don't know where this one's going to go. I think even if there's enough Texas Tech support from professional bettors, that we could still kind of sit in this range. And if there isn't as much support for Texas Tech from pro bettors, Duke's going to be the public side here. Maybe they drift out to a 1-point favorite or pick. At the time of this recording, though, here's what I would emphasize. The consensus line here is Texas Tech -1. However, Texas Tech money line -115 is a far better bet than -1, -10. So, as it stands now, let's give out Texas Tech money line minus the 115. That is the better price than going and laying -1, -10. So, that's all I got here.
Hey, no,
I'm tapped out.
It's a tricky time of year. There's no doubt that over the last couple of seasons, college basketball, when you look at the advent of a lot of these analytic websites that you made mention to multiple times, not only through this podcast, but the other, the market has gotten significantly tighter. And if we recorded this Sweet 16 podcast about 4 or 5 years ago, there's not a doubt in my mind that we would have had a chance to get Texas Tech +3 minus $1.20. But the markets evolve. You handle, what's been thrown your way. And it goes without saying for a lot of our listeners that have been with us throughout football season that we know is our bread and butter. Bet accordingly. As a result, college basketball, extremely high variance, as Payne has tried to drum home a number of times. So don't feel because the schedule is dwindling as we get so close to handing out a national championship trophy that you have to go whole hog and hammer away on some of these games, in my opinion.
I concur.
So,
all right, let's get out of
All
Dodge.
right, with that being said, I want to encourage all of you guys again to follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. You can follow me there. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Special thanks to John Sheeran. He'll be back with us for our Final Four podcast as well. And with a Red Raiders ticket in hand come Thursday, Friday evening, it all blends together. Hopefully we'll see you at the window.